That's off. It's probably easy to hear me. Yes, good evening. Welcome to our December lecture. Pleased to see so many here in the flesh, and also welcome to those who are joining us online. I'm Steve Rogers, the chairman of the branch, for those who don't know me. I'd like to welcome Guy Thomas to give us our lecture tonight. Guy worked here at the university as a business development officer and was instrumental in establishing their degree apprenticeships. And I know that Dr. Rodney Day, who's the Dean of the School of Engineering, Computer Science and Physics, and our Vice President is very keen to continue and enhance that work and establish more degree apprenticeships. Guy works at or is a tour guide at the RAF Museum, and when he was working here at the university, he helped develop the Hatfield Aerodrome Heritage Trail, and now provides tours of it. Had a lifelong interest in aviation, so I think we have a very entertaining talk about the heritage in Hertfordshire. Guy, over to you.
Right. Thanks, Stephen, for that introduction. And yes, it is, hopefully you'll find it entertaining and interesting. It's a story. It's going to be a story of the development of aviation in Hertfordshire. And I'm going to broaden it out to include not just the characters, but the aircraft, the airfields, and the development. So I hope to cover the whole span of aviation development in Hertfordshire from 1911 effectively to 2021. So we'll start with the early details, and I hope you'll enjoy the journey. Questions at the end, if you may, please. So we'll start in Hertford with some characters from the earliest days of aviation. And the very first one who was involved with this was a guy called Merle Pemberton Billing. He was certainly one of the most colourful characters associated with early aviation. And he was born in 1881, had an aptitude for mechanics, and was inspired by the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903. Having made some money from a typewriter invention, he purchased a steam yacht on the south coast, where he met a like-minded engineer, Hubert Scott Payne, and set up the Supermarine Aircraft Company at Woolston in Southampton. So he actually designed, his first boat was called the PB-1, Pemberton Billing 1, and he also learned to fly and obtained his Royal Aero certificate in 1913, so just prior to the outbreak of war. But for some time he'd been considering entering Parliament, and in 1916 stood as the independent air candidate for East Hart, so this is his link, which he won by over 1,000 votes, and moved in with his wife Dot to the Hive in Bingio, which happens to be just down the road from where I am. And so for people I gave this talk to local people, I go into a bit of detail about the property now, and also a bit about the village area there. However, in 1921, he resigned from Parliament and moved to Burnham-on-Crouch, where he lived out his final days. Between 1903 and 1940, he'd filed over 70 British patents, which is a huge number for those days. So our next character is a guy called William E. Johns, well-known author of the famous Biggles books. Born in 1893, he lived at a place called 43 Cowbridge, which is just at the bottom of somewhere called Port Peel in Hertford again. And there's a blue plaque on the wall of his original house. He was born in 1893. He lived at 43 Cowbridge and attended Royal Richard Hell School, which is a local secondary school in Hertford, in 1905. And in 1913, he joined the TA, was mobilised in August 1914, and fought at Gallipoli before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps. In 1916, posted to Thetford in Norfolk, close to where his wife Maud and only son Jack lived. So he became an instructor and bomber pilot flying the DH4 bomber. So this is where there's a link with de Havilland, who was designing aircraft in the First World War. More about that later on. So Johns was shot down and taken prisoner in 1918. After the war, he remained in the RAF, retiring in 1927. And after leaving the RAF, he became a newspaper correspondent, air correspondent, and started writing books. and I'm sure you're familiar with these particular ones. He actually penned over 160 books in the end. The first Builds book was actually written in 1932, and his books became excellent propaganda value by the Air Ministry. A little known fact here is that he rejected T.E. Lawrence, i.e. Lawrence of Arabia, at his interview board. So Johns was on the interview panel. For Lawrence was giving a false name, but he was eventually recruited as John Hugh Ross and served for several years in the RAF. The rest is legendary. So we now move slightly west. So if we picture Hertfordshire, I've not got a map of all the airfields there, but I'm going to give you some directions. So we're moving west from Hertford, and we move to a place called London Coney, which some of you will be familiar with, where in 1915 an airfield was established. Now this is part of the government's development plan to set up landing grounds in Hertfordshire, or in fact round London, but Hertfordshire was a particularly attractive site. And the government was expanding its landing grounds infrastructure. Hertfordshire actually had two sites identified, one of them at London Coney and a second at Sawbridgeworth. More about that later. Whilst the Sawbridgeworth site was retained purely as a day and night landing ground, London Coney was actually developed as a proper airfield in order to train up Royal Flying Corps pilots for the Western Front. So, located between Harper Lane, adjacent to the what is now the M25, to the north, and Shenley Lane to the south, it was requisitioned from the local landowner in 1916. It soon became a fully functional training airfield comprising several hangars, maintenance base and accommodation for staff and servicemen. And here we have an aerial photo taken at about 2,000 feet in an Avro 504 in 1916. So you can see at the top end of the screen, basically that leads up to Shenley, and the bottom end leads down to London Coney. It was actually designated London Coney rather than Shenley because Shenley was closely aligned with the word Kenley, and they didn't want to cause any confusion. So London Coney was the name that was actually selected. So in late 1916, 56 Squadron arrived and started training up on the new SE5A Fighter. New arrivals included RAeS Albert Ball and the writer and poet Cecil Lewis. Another well-known pilot who joined a little later on with 74 Squadron was James McCudden, who was soon to become another Royal Flying Corps Air Ace and win the Victoria Cross like Ball. This is a photograph of the two of them at that time. The new commanding officer was a guy called Major Blomfield, whose job it was to get the squadron ready for its move to France. And air accidents were actually quite common during this time. However, once overcome, pilots quickly started to develop their navigation and gunnery skills, often flying over the reservoirs west of London Coney at nearby Aldman. The photos I've included here in these black and white shots depict some of the aircraft and pilots, including Captain Jim McRoberts, seen here with his wife and newborn in winter 1916, shortly before the squadron was deployed to France. A little later, US pilots joined London Coney, flying British aircraft with what was effectively US markings, like this Avro 504K. So 56 Squadron was once ready for operations, took off for France in early 1917, and whilst further pilots and squadrons joined London Coney for training over the next year or so, eventually exercises were wound down, and in 1919, the airfield was returned to farmland, in fact, as it is today. Looking north here towards the M25. So from the earlier black and white shot, we were around the other way now, facing north, with the M25 just running across the top of the field there. Hangars would have been down the right-hand side here, and maintenance sheds along the top. Airfields, of course, in those days were all grass, so it was very cumbersome landing and that's one of the reasons why there were quite a few accidents at that time. Okay, so by the end of World War I, the UK's aircraft manufacturers had been established, and Hertfordshire was soon to play a major role in aircraft production. Two well-known aircraft designers who'd started manufacturing aircraft during World War I in North London were now seeking more land and moved away from London north to Hertfordshire. The first of these was Handley Page, who bought land a few miles north of Radlett in 1929, where he established Handley Page Aircraft Limited. And this is an early photograph taken in 1929 of the original hangar that was built, the railway line passing along the bottom there, and aircraft deployed just inside that strip. And the company was soon to develop land right along the edge of the railway line. So Frederick Hanley Page was born, again, a Victorian basically, born in 1885 in Cheltenham, and later the young Frederick studied electrical engineering at Finsbury Technical College. He started his career working for a local electrical machinery business, becoming their chief designer at the early age of 22 years. However, he was drawn by the allure of aviation and started making aeroplanes at Cricklewood before moving to Radlett, ironically only 3 miles west of London Coney Airfield. His most successful aircraft in World War I had been the HP400 Bomber, many of which, that's Sir Frederick Hanley Page, and moving on, the HP400 Bomber, many of which had become military surplus after the war and were converted into passenger carrying aircraft, soon to become the early airliners of the 1920s. So about 650 of these bombers were built in total, and about 23 were converted for civilian use. So one of Hanley Page's most successful airliners a little bit later on was the HP42 Class, which Imperial Airways, the forerunner of British Airways, purchased in 1930. 4 of these aircraft, carrying 38 passengers, flew on the western route from the London, Croydon to Paris, and Croydon was the London airport of those days. But carrying 38 passengers flew onto the western route from London, Croydon to Paris, and 4, carrying 24 passengers, flew on the eastern route to the Middle East and India. These aircraft epitomised early passenger flying in January, and luxury had a credible safety record. Named after the Greek gods, Heracles carried more than 100,000 passengers, which was a huge number for those days. And in 1935 was airborne on 361 days. By 1937 had flown over 1 million miles. However, with the advent of World War II, Hanley Page went on to design and manufacture the famous Hampden and Halifax bombers. And after World War II, Hanley Page developed a number of post-war aircraft, the RAF, including the Hastings. Radlett was also hosted the first SBAC Society of British Aircraft Companies air show, and the first Farnborough as we know it today. With the advent of the post-World War II Cold War, Hanley Page designed and produced one of the V-Force bombers, the Victor. The other two being the Avro Vulcan and, of course, Vickers Valiant. And it was the Avro Vulcan, refueled by the Victor, that flew to the Falklands and successfully bombed the runway with a direct hit at Port Stanley in 1982. So a great span of aviation history in terms of 1960 right through to 1982. In the 1960s, Hanley Page designed a new commuter airline, the Jetstream. And during the 1960s, most of the UK's independent aircraft companies were being absorbed into the aviation groups. So, for example, Hawker Siddeley and the British Aviation Corporation. However, Hanley Page chose to remain independent. And during production of the Jetstream, the company started to run short of cash. This eventually led to its demise and receivership in 1969. However, Scottish Aviation took over production of the Jetstream, and many until recently have been undertaking navigation training with the RAF. The only Jetstream 31 flying in the UK today is based at the Cranfield Institute of Technology, which has a mention later in the presentation. So my last photo is of the Hanley Page site looking north towards St Albans, taken a few years ago. Not much left of the original airfield. And again, we've got the M25 and the railway line. All the hangars now being converted or taken down, and it's an industrial park effectively, with names around the industrial park which represent the fact that the company was there. So moving on. Our second Hertfordshire-based aviation manufacturing pioneer was Geoffrey de Havilland, close to the home. And here's a photograph of him seen here with his family, his 3 sons and his wife. And in 1930, he bought 150 acres of farmland at Hatfield, here at Hatfield, and established the de Havilland Flying School, having moved from their Stag Lane site in North London. So this is a shot here of the original airfield as set up with the de Havilland Flying School at the north end, and top route down there is what is now the A1. This plot just beside the clubhouse was to be the site of the squash courts and beacon, which I'll come on to later. So the de Havilland Aircraft Company was soon to grow into a large, successful manufacturer with production facilities in Canada and New Zealand. And this shows the shot of the administration building that no doubt you'll recognise today as the home of the Hertford Police Station. Now, Geoffrey de Havilland, like Handley Page, had been smitten at an early age with aircraft, and the Wright brothers' first successful flight in 1903. He built his first aircraft in Fulham with an advance of £1,000 left for him in his grandfather's will. He then designed and built the Flying Corps' first aircraft, the BE-2, and worked with Airco as a designer at Hendon. And after World War I, he set up de Havilland Aircraft with his original Fulham colleague, Frank Hurl, and moved to Stag Lane in the 1920s. Now, Hatfield, from 1930 on, was soon to become famous for the early King's Cup air races. And flying light aircraft around markers at very low level. Here is an early shot of a de Havilland 53 Hummingbird taken during the 1933 King's Cup air race, and used its reputation to grow its flying school, which later included the RAF Reserve Flying Training School based at Hatfield. So the famous de Havilland range of aircraft, or particularly of Moth Aircraft, formed the mainstay of light aviation production here at Hatfield during the 1930s. And the most well-known being the de Havilland Tiger Moth, which no doubt many of you are familiar with, designed 90 years ago this year. Many examples are still flying today. So the little known fact here that you may or may not know that de Havilland, or the name Moth name, is used. And does anybody know here where it comes from? The reason for it? Yeah. Yep. Entomology, which I understand is the study of butterflies and moths. Yeah. So hence the first names he gave to the respective DH Moth aircraft. And for those of you who really would like to know, there are a total of 7 Moth designs in the 1930s, and they were manufactured essentially starting at Stag Lane but ending up at Hatfield. They include the DH60, the DH80 Bush Moth, 82 Tiger Moth, 83 Fox Moth, 85 Levin Moth, 87 Hornet Moth, and 94 Moth Minor. Many of these variants were also manufactured under license in Canada and New Zealand up until the outbreak of World War II. So this particular company was expanding incredibly, so in terms of not only production in the UK but also overseas. So in 1934, our next slide shows de Havilland took on a challenge to build an aircraft to compete in the Mac Robertson-sponsored London to Australian air race. The de Havilland 88 Comet Racer, his 88th design, effectively, GAC SS, named Grosvenor House, flown by Scott and Black, won the race, setting a world record of 8 days, 20 hours and 47 minutes. It's still maintained in flying condition at the Shuttleworth collection in Bedfordshire today. So an important design point about this aircraft was that the Comet Racer was constructed as an all-ply design, later used to build the DH-91 Albatross airliner. And the wood technology also enabled de Havilland to develop the famous Mosquito, of which the prototype and 2 others are on display at the de Havilland Museum at Salisbury Hall. So jet aircraft development after World War II, another area that de Havilland was getting heavily involved in, included the Vampire, Venom and Sea Vixen, and of course, the world's first jet airliner, the DH-106 Comet, test flown by John Cat's-Eyes Cunningham in 1952. This is actually a shot of Cunningham, but actually not the Comet he's climbing out of. Does anybody know what aircraft he's stepping out of there? Okay, it's actually a Lancastrian, which was at Hatfield, but the point is it was Cunningham who was chief test pilot who flew the Comet. Now, the design remained in service for over 60 years, finally being retired as the RAF Nimrod in 2011. And further airliners manufactured at Hatfield include the Trident, the HS-125, and of course the BAE-146. A very successful 70-seater regional airliner, the last production aircraft built here at Hatfield. De Havilland had been developing jet engines and missiles as well, and set up a separate production and test facility at Hatfield, where the famous Blue Streak and Fire Streak missiles were manufactured. Seen here, fitted to de Havilland's Sea Vixen. This is a 110th design of de Havilland's. So, however, during the 70s and 80s, costs of aircraft design, like Handley Page was finding, proved that design development were very challenging and expensive. De Havilland was eventually absorbed into one of the UK's two aircraft manufacturing groups named BAC, later British Aerospace, for production of the BA-146, then moved to Chester. A total that had been built in Hatfield of 387 aircraft. Sadly to say, the aerodrome at Hatfield finally closed in 1994. However, many of the original buildings still exist today, adjacent to the University of Hertfordshire's de Havilland campus, including the flight test hangar, now at David Lloyd Sports Club, and I've included a similar shot taken 55 years earlier with one of the Comets outside. The University School of Aeronautical Engineering emerged from the original de Havilland Technical School, and in 1997 a statue of Sir Jeffreys de Havilland was unveiled by the Duke of Edinburgh. In 2011, the original de Havilland beacon, thing I mentioned earlier, which was mounted on top of a building at the north end of the airfield, the idea being that would provide a beacon for pilots flying in open cockpit aircraft. Those Moths had a range of about 30-35 miles, so it was a very useful item. This item was recovered from North Weald and restored through some funding through the university and mounted just outside the de Havilland campus. And the Sir Geoffrey de Havilland Memorial, of course, is over on this side. And the idea was that the memorial fund that was set up as well was to sponsor postgraduate studies in aerospace engineering, and many of the prizes that are awarded through the society actually go to those students. As part of the de Havilland Heritage Site, there is now a Hatfield Heritage Trail, which is this is one of the boards, and there's 10 of these around the site, which is sponsored by the university. I've run tours on the Heritage Trail in 2021, so if anybody's interested in looking for a tour in 2022, let me know. Now, moving on to the next stage of my presentation, move on to a bit more about the aerodrome sites in Hertfordshire. So there were in fact a further 8 aerodromes established, plus a few airfield strips in the county. The first one is Leavesden. The Leavesden factory and aerodrome were originally used by the de Havilland Aircraft Company in World War II, where they built the Mosquito and other aircraft under subcontract. So at Hatfield were building essentially Mosquitoes, but also outsourced to Leavesden. And at the end of the war, they converted the factory to an engine facility, which remains until 1963. When de Havilland became part of Hawker Siddeley and merged with Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce continued until 91, with the use of the airfield ceasing in 94. 1 year later, the site was sold to EON, who now produce films such as the Bond film, or produced films such as the Bond film GoldenEye, and it's now owned by Warner Brothers, who have the Harry Potter exhibition in their studios there. Our next airfield, which is the only airfield now operating in Hertfordshire, is Helstree. So from its humble beginnings in the early 1930s as a landing strip associated with an exclusive country club, Helstree is now one of the foremost general aviation sites in the UK. It saw limited use in the pre-war years, being home to a couple of aircraft brokers and a flying club, but Helstree really came into its own during World War II, when it was used extensively for the overhaul and repair of large numbers of military aircraft. After the war, when civil flying resumed, many film celebrities have flown from Helstree, given its proximity to Elstree Studios and London. The aerodrome was in danger of closing down in 1950 when the hangars needed re-roofing and a manager had to be found. So a certain John Holder, who some of you may have heard of, took on the job and was in the post some 50 years later. Helstree is the only licensed aerodrome operating in Hertfordshire today. Our next airfield is Panzanga. So in early 1940, whilst the Hatfield site went on to become a major centre of aircraft production development, it became a nationally strategic site, and as a site that needed to be protected in the event of war. There had already been a bombing at Hatfield. There was high risk there would be a further one. So as a consequence, the Air Ministry decided to identify alternative sites that could be used as decoys, and it was used here, Panzanga, formerly known as Holwell Hyde, as it was originally known. In 1941, it became a designated forward landing ground, and in number one elementary flying training school transferred from Hatfield to Panzanga, utilising the de Havilland Tigermoth. After the war, it was redesignated number 1 reserve flying school and re-equipped with chipmunks, which flew there until 1953. Since then, as it is taken a few years ago now. It's become the home of the North London Flying School and finally closed in 2016 and now has quite a bit of that housing in that shot has now encroached onto the airfield, and that's the reason why they closed it. Our next airfield, working over to the east now, is Brooksboro. This aerodrome was founded in 1930 by the Frogley family. Two sons, Roger and Buster, were speedway bikers who raced at the nearby Rye House, now a karting track, where Lewis Hamilton, or should I say Sir Lewis Hamilton, Formula One champion, first learned to race. The growing excitement of light aviation was an obvious move for them, and they bought their first DH-60 Moth aircraft and started the Huntsman Essex Aero Club at nearby Brooksboro. The club was opened in 1931 and attended by the famous Amy Johnson, who later became the club's president with her husband Jim Morrison. The aerodrome expanded through the 1930s and also became home for London busmen, many of whom were trained as pilots at the club. In 1939, all civilian flying ceased, as indeed at most of the other airfields, and a new company was formed, Hartson Essex Aviation Limited, an aeronautical engineering base carrying out repairs for military aircraft. So like Helstree, it was carrying out the same type of activity. So after the war, Brooksboro reopened as Hartson Essex Aero Club 1946 Limited and brought a number of ex-military Tiger Moths to start the club. The flight continued until the ground was assessed for gravel extraction, which was one of the reasons why Handy Page sold their ground in the end, for gravel extraction. And in 1944, this airfield was closed. The flying club transferred to Stapleford Tawney in Essex, which had in fact been a satellite airfield to RAF North Weald during World War II, North Weald being in Essex, not covered on this presentation. In addition to these, we had 4 airfields developed purposely as military bases during World War II. So the first of these is Bobington. And this was an airfield which lies at the edge of the Chiltern Hills in West Herts, built by John Lang in 1941. It had the classic X design runways, or the A-class standard as it was known. And in 1942, it was taken over by Bomber Command, but never used, and became a US Air Force base for the 92nd US Bombing Flying Group. In September, they began raids in Europe, and in 1943, Captain Clark Gable visited Bovington and made a broadcast to America on the purchase of war bonds in support of the Lone Drive program. General Eisenhower, a few years later, flew into Bovington to plan for the eventual invasion of Europe. James Stewart, William Holden, Glenn Miller were also based at Bovington for a while. So after the war, Bovington was used for several film sets, for several wartime films, including the 633 Mosquito Squadron, and in 1968, the MOD announced its enclosure. This is a shot here taken in 1967 when it was used as an airfield during the making of the Battle of Britain film. Today the hangars have gone and only the control tower remains. Saturday car boot sales take up some of the runways, and these are gradually being broken up by Amy Construction. Moving further over to the east now, I'm going to talk about Huntsman. Now Huntsman lies just off the A414 between Hertford and Harlow. And these two, there were 2 runways built on the standard RAF design, officially opened in 1941. So we had Hurricanes from 85 Squadron, commanded by Squadron Leader Whitney Strait, who'd been a pre-war racing pilot, started night flying and training. And in 1943, raids over Europe began. Huntsman converted to flying Mosquitoes. 3 squadrons, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand, were based at Huntsman, and in 1944, one of the most famous raids took place from there. Undertaken was the attack on the Amiens prison led by Group Captain Pickard. The prison walls were breached and 258 prisoners escaped. Pickard was unfortunately killed during the raid. Canadian units then flew Mustangs in support of the invasion of Europe in June. And in 1945, the Canadians left. Huntsman closed, and today little remains except for a reduced runway used by microlight aircraft and a memorial stone representing those various countries that had pilots based there. Our next airfield, moving a little bit further east, is Hamstead, developed in 1942 as a US Air Force base, so the second one in Hertfordshire, developed runways using rubble from bombed out East London. Home to 398 Bomber Group, Glenn Miller and his band dropped in 1944 and for an impromptu concert for the base, and flew on to France, where his aircraft unfortunately disappeared over the English Channel. The aircraft was closed in 1960 and returned to farmland. Runway rubble excavated used to build the new M1 runway, and believe it or not, Hamstead was considered as one of 4 options for London's third airport. Under the Roskill Commission, they decided on developing Stansted Airport instead. Today, it has a navigation direction finder for Eastern England, the aircraft landing at Stansted, Gatwick and Heathrow. Our next airfield is a place called Sawbridgeworth, and this is the last of the military bases built during the war. This was originally designed as a night and day landing ground. As I mentioned right at the beginning of my presentation, it's one of 2 identified in Hertfordshire. It was actually a landing ground, closed actually in November 1918, so at the end of the First World War, and the land returned to agricultural use for 10 years or so, until a short-lived gliding club was formed at Shingle Hall, just down the road from there in 1928. In 1937, just prior to World War II, the RAF established an advanced landing ground north of Much Haddam Road and west of Mathamswood. In World War II, and in strict secrecy, a certain Wing Commander Geddes was tasked with the training of pilots for the Special Operations Executive, and in 1941, flying Lysanders. Mustangs were also based there, as we see here in this particular shot, and after D-Day and advance into Europe, RAF Sawbridgeworth, like so many other airfields, became redundant and flying ceased in November 1944. Today, it's perhaps appropriate that a local industrial park is named after the aircraft that flew from there. There are also a small number of airfield strips used by small aircraft, including microlights and gyrocopters. So these are operational today, and they're mainly located in East Hertfordshire, High Cross, Gravely, Rush Green and Cotterell. So through to the final stage of my presentation tonight, it's going to cover where are we today with Hertfordshire's aerospace industry. And I'm going to start here with Hertfordshire's long aviation heritage makes it a key location by the industry for aerospace engine component and electronics and service suppliers, with several thousand people working in air and space manufacture today. So where are they all located? They're not here at Hatfield, for example, and further out. Industry experts view Stevenage as the centre of the UK space industry. Here we have a shot of Airbus Defence and Space, Europe's leading supplier of satellites, launchers and space services, has a major spacecraft design and manufacturing facilities employing some 1,500 scientists, engineers and technicians. It developed satellites, for example, for NASA's 2018 Solar Orbiter, and built the Mars rover for the ExoMars mission in 2018. On the 7th of February 2019, the ExoMars rover was named Rosalind Franklin in honour of a scientist who made key contributions to the understanding of the molecular structures of DNA. So the Airbus site is also the headquarters of Paradigm Secure Communications, and Paradigm, which is part of the Airbus group, is doing some cutting-edge work developing voice, video and internet communications equipment for the UK Armed Forces. Other companies such as Swift Aerospace, Senior Aerospace Thermal Engineering, Aeroflex Test Solutions and Goodrich Aerospace are among the many companies taking advantage of local talent pools and the sector's broad market reach. In fact, MBGA, based in Stevenage, is a world leader in missiles and missile systems. The site in Stevenage now has led development work on the dual mode seeker Brimstone missile used by the crews of the RAF Tornado GR4 and Typhoon F2 aircraft, and considered to be unrivaled in precision weaponry today. The need to develop skills in science, technology, engineering and maths has led to the establishment as well of the STEM Discovery Centre. And this is an attractive, interactive science and engineering education centre in Stevenage, run by North Herts College, jointly funded by the Airbus Foundation and Hertfordshire Learning and Enterprise. Here we have a recent shot of Britain's astronauts at Peak, explaining the fundamentals of space technology to the recent generation of potential astronauts at the Discovery Centre. And so looking to the future of flight and the need to cut our dependency on fossil fuels, we have the development of electric aircraft. And just this last September 2021, this Volt Aero Casio 1 was the first hybrid electric aircraft to fly across the channel from Calais to Cranfield. Ironically, this electric flight marks 112 years since the first petrol engine flight across the Channel by Louis Blériot in 1909. So building on 110 years of aviation heritage in Hertfordshire, hopefully the county will continue to be a key location for aerospace engine and component suppliers and electronics in the aerospace industry for many years to come. So to conclude, I'd like to add my thanks to several contacts who have provided the slides shown in my presentation. Enclosure Association, BAE Systems, London Coney History Society, University of Hertfordshire, the RF Museum, Milbury Museum, and many friends and colleagues at Frederick. And that's it. Do you have any questions?